What's up guys, welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Erdell, and in today's video we're going to be covering the top 10 chess openings for black against the move d4, starting off with the Dutch defense. And this really does remind me of the bird's opening. I mean, let's say white plays something quiet here, like g3, looking to fianchetto their bishop. We're now going to play knight f6 using our knight to really fight for the light squares in the center of the board. And the very next move, we have a pretty big decision to make concerning our dark squared bishop on f8. We could play g6 and fianchetto the bishop, or e6, bishop e7, and castle kingside. And honestly, either of these is fine. The main line at the grandmaster level is g6, fianchettoing that bishop, and then castling kingside. And notice here, there's not really a ton that white could have done from stopping this setup. I mean, white could play here a move like bishop g5 and take our knight, but in that case, we just take the bishop back and say thank you for the bishop pair. And if white plays a more traditional option like c4, we're now going to continue with d6, and then the very next move, the somewhat strange looking option of queen e8. Usually we don't want to play a move like this, but in this position, this is a very strong and dangerous idea used by grandmasters for decades. I mean, following the move b3, we can now expand in the center of the board with e5. Notice the last two moves before this, d6 and queen e8, really served to support this move. And now in this position, white really does need to take our center pawn, but after this, we can simply take back. Now here, we would love to get in this option of e4, forming a very strong light squared pawn train all the way out to the center of the board. And on top of that, our bishop on g7 would become a very active piece. So here, white really does need to play e4, and against this, we're not going to take the pawn, but instead play the move knight c6. And here as black, we have a very solid position, two pawns right in the center of the board, a solid queen holding this position together. And now we have some knight takes e4 ideas, queen e7, queen d7. If bishop a3 is played, attacking our rook, we can always play rook f7 and swing that rook over, attacking the queen. And if white captures our pawn on f5, we can simply take it back with the bishop, rook d8 on the way, and I absolutely love black's game here. Another great option against the move d4 is the Slav or Semi-Slav defense, which starts off with d5 and really is a response against the queen's gambit with c4. In this position, we're not going to take the gambit, but instead decline it and go into the Slav defense with c6. A quiet move, but a very strong one, simply solidifying the positioning of that pawn on d5. I mean, here white could take our pawn, but we're simply going to take back. And with a symmetrical position, white's chances of gaining a good advantage going into the middle game honestly aren't very high. So most of the time, you're probably going to see a move like knight f3, white trying to create some tension here, but now we simply continue with knight f6, and the very next move, play e6. Notice here how we have really formed a pawn pyramid supporting that pawn on d5, and we really do have a solid position with really no weaknesses. I mean, if white plays a move like e3, we could play knight bd7, and now bishop d6. Yes, we do have a strong pawn chain here, but our bishop on d6 is also a very active piece, really holding down the squares of c5 and especially e5. If a move like bishop d3, we can now castle kingside, and then now that the bishop has moved, we can take that pawn on c4 and then play the move b5, expanding on the queen side of the board, gaining a tempo on that bishop. And the very next move, we're going to play bishop b7. And as y'all can see here, we have a very solid game. In the case of e4, we're going to continue with e5, fighting for the center of the board, and black has great chances to fight for the win here. Another great option against the move d4 is the old Benoni defense with c5. I absolutely love the system for black, using a wing pawn to fight against the center pawn. And I mean, here in this position, most grandmasters agree that d5 is the best move. But let's answer the obvious question, why not just take the pawn on c5? I mean, it appears to be a free pawn. Why not just take it? Well, this turns out to be a mistake because we can now play the move e6, looking to take this pawn with tempo and potentially put some pressure on that very vulnerable pawn on f2. And here, if white tries to hold on to that pawn with a move like b4, we cannot waste time here, guys. We can't play passive moves like knight f6 or h6. We need to go after this pawn chain right away with the move a5. Now notice here, white can't really defend this pawn with a3, because we're simply going to take that pawn on b4, and if a takes b4, thank you for the rook on a1. And here if white plays c3, we can take that pawn on b4, and following c takes b4, it may appear as if white has successfully held on to their extra pawn and is going to go into the middle game with an advantage. But now we have the stunning move of queen f6, and it's very obvious here that white's pawns are simply too far exposed. We are attacking that rook on a1, and the only way to save it is by playing the move knight c3. But against this, we simply take that piece off the board. We're going to continue with queen b2 or queen a3, and here, guys, we're simply up a piece. Black is winning. So as tempting as taking that pawn may be, d5 is simply the best option. Now keep in mind, if white doesn't take this pawn and doesn't play d5, we can simply take that pawn on d4, continue with knight f6, knight c6. We're going to have two center pawns versus white's one. And I honestly think that black is better there. So here, if the move d5, we're now going to continue with another stunning option of e5. Trying to take full control of the center in this game. White may be tempted yet again to take on e6 with en passant, but I don't think this is the best option either, because we can now take towards the center of the board with our f-pawn, continue with the move d5, knight c6, knight f6, and I absolutely love black's game there. And a move like d6, looking to really cramp our positions, isn't the best option, because we can simply play queen b6 and say thank you for the pawn. What about the best move, which is e4? Well, against this, we're simply going to continue now with d6, and really no matter what white plays, we're now going to continue with knight f6, g6, fianchetto our bishop, and then castle kingside. And I really do like the attacking chances that black has here. Following the move knight d2, we can play knight e8. And keep in mind, guys, white can always play the move f4 and try to break things open, but this only helps us because we're going to take that pawn, and our bishop on g7 is going to become a very active minor piece. If a move here like knight c4, we're now going to continue with knight d7, followed by a6. And notice here how playing the key moves in the old Benoni defense of knight e8, knight d7, and a6, we really do have all of our bases covered here. It's really hard for white to continue in this position with any attacking chances. And now, following a move like bishop e3, we're going to attack on the king side of the board with f5, putting pressure on e4, and also looking to maybe even play the move f4, attacking the bishop on e3. This is a very fun position to play with as the black pieces. So we just covered the old Benoni with c5. What's the difference between the old Benoni and the regular Benoni? Well, with the regular variation, we're now going to play the move knight f6 and then play the next move c5. Yet again, it's white's best option to play the move d5 here. And now as black, we do have a few different options. We could play g6, d6, but I personally like the modern variation with e6. Putting pressure right in the center of the board. Yet again, white really shouldn't take this pawn on e6 because we can take towards the center of the board, continue with d5, and black is simply going to have full control of the center and very easy development. And if white doesn't take the pawn on e6, we're simply going to continue with taking that pawn followed by d6. By playing this, we're trying to take control of those dark squares right in the center of the board. And then the next two moves, we're going to continue with g6 followed by bishop g7. Notice here, by having our pawns on c5 and d6, we really are trying to control these dark squares in the center of the board. Following a move like h3, we're now going to castle kingside. The very next move, following something like bishop d3, we can actually play the crazy looking option of b5, and black has great attacking chances in this game. So we just covered the regular Benoni, which starts off with knight f6 and then playing the move c5. And now against d5, we could go into the modern variation, but another very strong and dangerous chess opening for black against the move d4 is the Benko Gambit with b5. Absolutely crazy looking move, throwing down our b-pawn, putting pressure on c4, which is a very key pawn for white in this position as it protects the pawn on d5, which could be very vulnerable if it doesn't have strong defense. 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 times out of 100, you're going to see white take that pawn, in which case we simply offer white another. Now here, if white does decline the pawn with a move like b6, really our game plan isn't going to change, except for the fact that we're going to take that pawn on b6. What about the accepted variation with b takes a6? Well, we're currently down 2 pawns, but we're going to continue here with g6 and then capture capture that pawn on a6. And here development for black really does come pretty easy. I mean, following a move like g3, we can fianchetto our bishop on g7, continue with d6, and the very next move, play knight bd7 and castle kingside. There's nothing white can do from stopping up this setup. And notice here just how strong our pawn structure is. I mean, we as black really don't have many weaknesses, and some of you may be wondering, wait a second, why are we down a pawn? I mean, I'm not looking to checkmate my opponent's king. Why did I give up a pawn? Well, with the Benko Gambit, we're not looking to checkmate our opponent's king in the first 10 to 15 moves, but we're really looking to play the long game. I mean, following the move castling kingside, we're now going to play queen a5 followed by rook d b8. By putting our rooks on these two files, we're really putting the pressure on white here. And now if a move like queen c2, we can drop our queen back and then play a move like knight b6. We as black have very active pieces here. Both of our knights are threatening to capture that center pawn on d5. We have a very active bishop pair on a6, slicing down on e2, and an active bishop on g7, slicing down on that knight on c3 once this knight gets out of the way. And yet again, on top of that, both of our rooks are very active. Now, again, some of you may be wondering, okay, that's cool, we have active pieces, but why am I down a pawn? Again, we're trying to play the long game. Let's just say for a second that all of the pieces were traded off except our rooks and white's rooks. This is the position that you would get. I literally took all the other pieces off except for white's rooks and black's rooks. Again, notice here how both of our rooks are very active, and we're actually currently threatening to take that pawn on a2, even this game out, and have our rook on the second rank. So here in this position, white may play a move like rook a1, in which case we're simply going to play rook a3 followed by rook b4. And notice here we have, again, very solid pawn structure and a rook on b4 and a3. These pawns literally cannot move, and white really can't do anything in this position. I mean, sure, they're up a pawn, but if white ever tries to give these rooks any kind of freedom, they're going to lose at least one pawn and probably two. I mean, here in this position, we're actually threatening to play the move rook d4 and just capture off that pawn on d5, and if a move like e3 is played, we can simply continue with king g7, king f6, king e5, and if f4, looking to prevent that, we can play king f5 and king e4. I absolutely love this game for black. Again, with the Benko Gambit, we're giving up a pawn, but in return, we have great attacking chances, and if white does manage to trade off their pieces, that's completely okay. I still think that black is better. Another solid system for black against the move d4 is seen with the Nimzo and Bogo-Indian. With this, we start off with the move knight f6, but now against c4, we play the move e6. And really our purpose here is to play the move bishop b4. Against knight c3, we play this move and we see the Nimzo-Indian Defense. And with knight f3, we still play bishop b4, but now with check, and we're in the Bogo-Indian. Let's first start off with the move knight c3. Well, against this, we're going to go into the Nimzo, pinning that knight on c3 to the king on e1. And there's a ton of different moves I can play here. I mean, they could play something like bishop d2, queen c2, e3, knight f3, g3. But my personal favorite move to play against is a3. Against this, we're simply going to take that knight on c3. And because a3 was played, we do have a little bit of time now and are really going to look to attack this pawn on c4. How on earth do we do this? Well, we're going to play the move b6, and now if white plays a move like f3, we're simply going to continue with knight c6 followed by bishop a6, attacking that pawn on c4. Notice here how white does have an advantage in the center of the board and could even play the move e5, but we're actually completely okay with this. We're just going to play the move knight g8, and now if a move like bishop d3, play knight a5. Notice here how both of our minor pieces are attacking that pawn on c4 and actually threatening to take it the very next move. And if white plays something like queen a4, we're now going to play queen c8 with the idea of playing c5. The very next move, we're looking to take on d4 and really put a ton of pressure on c4 with our queen, bishop, and knight. And if white tries to take the pawn on c5, that's really not a good idea because we simply take it back with the queen. Again, three of our pieces are attacking that pawn on c4. Rook ac8 is on the way, and black is simply better here. So against knight c3, we can play bishop b4 going into the Nimzo-Indian Defense. Against knight f3, we play bishop b4 going into the Bogo Bogo-Indian Defense, and here most of the time you're probably going to see a move like bishop d2, in which case we're not going to capture this bishop because that would only give white a larger edge in development, but we're simply going to play the move queen e7, and white may be tempted to capture our bishop on b4, but this really isn't a good idea because we're going to capture back with check, attacking 2 pawns on b2 and c4, and needless to say, if white captures this bishop, we're simply going to go up a pawn. So here white should probably play a move like g3, in which case we're simply going to continue with knight c6, and the general rule of thumb is the very last chance you get to capture that bishop on d2, do it. I mean, here in this position, white would love to castle kingside and then play a move like knight c3. We need to capture bishops off the board right away, and now after the move knight takes d2, continue with d6. Really, our plan with the Bogo-Indian Defense is pretty simple. We're going to put our knights on f6 and c6, our queen on e7, and put our pawn pair on e6 and d6 as well. I mean, following the move castling kingside, we're now going to castle, and whenever the move e4 is played, we are ready to play e5, fighting for the center of the board, attacking that pawn on d4, and some may be wondering, wait a second, I mean, if white plays d5, our knight is forced back to b8. But we're completely okay with this. By playing these moves, e4, d5, and c4, the dark squares are kind of weak in this position, and we're really going to look to prioritize taking those later on in this game. I mean, following a move like knight e1, which, by the way, is the best option for white, we're simply going to continue with a5, expanding on the queen side of the board and attacking that b4 square. And now if a move like knight d3, we can play knight a6, attacking b4 and c5, and following a move like queen c2, play c6, simply putting some pressure on white's central pawn chain right here in the center of the board. And this is a very hard position to play with the white pieces. I mean, against the move like f4, there have been 3 games seen in this position at the master and grandmaster level, and black has won all 3 of them. There was a game that continued with c takes c5, and now as white took the center pawn on e5, we simply take back and then play bishop g4 with some potential bishop e2 ideas, attacking both the rook and the knight. So here white played the move rook e1, but we now see rook fc8 attacking the queen, and the very next move, knight c5. I mean, again, attacking the queen, attacking the knight on d3, and following queen a3, we now see b5, threatening to play the move b4, trapping the queen on a3, forcing the white knight to take it. So here we see the move knight takes c5, in which black simply took that knight back, continued to reinforce that rook with rook ac8, and went on to win this game in nice fashion. So we just covered the Bogo-Indian with bishop b4 check, but our 8th good chess opening option for black against the move d4 is seen with the Queen's Indian Defense, in which case we play the move b6. Really, our whole idea here is that we're trying to get this bishop active on c8. I mean, against a move like g3, we're going to play bishop a6, attacking the pawn on c4, because this bishop won't be defending it, as it will be fianchettoed. And against a move like e3, we will simply play bishop b7 and say thank you for the long diagonal. Again, against the move g3, we're now going to play bishop a6, and e3 here would kind of defeat the purpose of g3. So here white may play a move like queen c2, queen a4, or even knight d2, but really I think the best move here for white is b3, in which case we can play bishop b4 check. Against bishop d2, we're simply going to drop that bishop back, continue with moves like c6 and d5, and black has a solid game. And against the move knight d2, we simply are winning with black in this position. This is a very easy move to play. I mean, really by playing this, white is trying to gain the bishop pair. Whole idea being if we take the bishop on d2, we just gave up a bishop for a knight, and white says thank you for the pair. However, in this position, we don't need to take the knight, but can play the move bishop c3, attacking the rook on a1, and the very next move, play bishop b7. Notice how this rook can't even move, and now we're threatening to play bishop e4, trapping the rook and gaining the exchange. And a move like queen c2 doesn't work because we simply take that pawn off on d4, and in this position, guys, I mean, we're simply up a pawn. If knight takes d4, we say thank you for the rook on h1, and here's black. We have a very nice game. So there's quite a few different options against d4 and c4 seen with the move e6. Some very solid chess openings. A very aggressive one is the King's Indian Defense seen with the move g6. Our whole idea here is that we're going to continue with bishop g7 and then continue with d6. This is a key move, really protecting c5 and especially that e5 square. against the move knight f3, we're going to castle kingside. And now against bishop e2, we have the key move of e5, expanding in the center of the board. And now as white, I mean, really the best moves are castling kingside or bishop e3, but let's answer the obvious question. Why can't white just take the pawn on e5? Well, this turns out to be a mistake because we can take back with our d-pawn, and if white tries to take back with the knight, we can now take back that queen with check. And now against knight takes d1, we're simply going to take that pawn on e4, have a centralized minor piece, and be attacking that knight on e5, and I think that black is simply better. And against bishop takes d1, well, we're still going to take on e4. Whole idea being that the very next move, we're going to capture that knight on e5, continue with the move like knight c6, and I simply think that black is clearly better here. Development here is extremely easy, and if you look at this position, white has two very awkward bishops on the first rank, d1, and especially this bishop on c1, which can't even move without giving up that pawn on b2. Black is simply better here. So guys, again, after d takes e5 and d takes e5, white really can't take that pawn on e5 at any point, even if white takes our queen, because knight takes e4 ideas will always be in the air, attacking that knight on e5, and black is simply better. So what about the move castling kingside? Well, now we're going to continue with knight c6, defending both the pawn and attacking that pawn on d4. Whole idea being against d5, we're going to swing our knight back into e7 and continue now with the move knight d7 or even knight e8. Idea being the very next move, we're going to push with f5, attacking e4, and even have potential f4 options attacking that bishop on e3, following a move like bishop f2, we're going to push with g5. And now as black, we are going to aggressively attack this king on g1 with moves like h5, knight g6, knight f6, g4. I have seen grandmasters such as Hikaru Nakamura play this against top-tier competition with great success. And last, but definitely not least, we have the Grunfeld Defense, which similarly to the King's-Indian Defense, we're going to start off with knight f6, followed by the move g6. But now after the move knight c3, we're going to change route. We're not going to play the move d6, bishop g7, and castling kingside. Instead, we're going to play the immediate d5, advancing right in the center of the board. And this is actually considered to be a hypermodern opening. Basically, what this means is that we give our opponent the opportunity to take control of the center of the board. I mean, here in this position, white could take our pawn on d5 and then advance with e4. Against this, we're going to take on c3, and some of you may be wondering, wait a second, why would we ever play an opening where white has two pawns right in the center of the board and a pawn on c3 defending that pawn on d4? Well, with any good hypermodern system, we're not simply going to play passive moves like c6 and e6 and just admit that white has a space advantage, but we are going to aggressively fight for counterattacking chances, specifically this pawn on d4 with bishop g7, followed by an immediate c5. I love this move for black, using a wing pawn, putting some pressure on that pawn on d4, and notice here how white can't really take our pawn because of bishop takes c3 with check, attacking both the king and the rook on a1. And here, honestly, my favorite variation to play against is when white tries to hold on to this pawn with a move like bishop e3. Now against this, we're simply going to play queen a5, threatening to take on c3. And now if queen d2 is played, we can castle and play the move rook d8. I mean, our queen on a5 is very active, attacking a2 and c3. We have a pawn, bishop, and rook all ganging up on that pawn on d4. And if a move like d5 is played, that's okay. We can simply play the move e6. Now both our bishop and our queen are attacking c3, and we have a pawn on e6 and a rook on d8 attacking that pawn on d5. I mean, if a move like c4 is played, trying to minimize both of those pressures, we could simply take that queen on d2 and now play the move b6. Here black has a very solid pawn structure. Notice how on the queen side of the board, all our pawns are in dark squares and our bishop on c8 is on a light square. Because of this, our bishop has a lot more activity and a lot more flexibility in this position. Same goes with our bishop on g7. Our dark squared bishop is surrounded by light squared pawns, and because of this, this bishop obviously has a lot of flexibility and a lot of activity going into the rest of this game. And I'd say, at least at first sight, it appears as if our knight on b8 is a very inactive piece and a very awkward piece. However, this is going to be arguably the most active piece in this game. Right now, we have the idea of playing knight a6 followed by knight b4, really attacking that pawn on a2, and a move like a3 really isn't possible, trying to prevent our knight from coming to b4 because of the fact that bishop b2 could be played, attacking both the rook and the pawn. So the next three moves are pretty obvious. We're just going to play knight a6 followed by knight b4. And now if a move like a3, we're going to play knight a2 attacking the opponent's rook. And if a move like rook c2, play knight c3. I mean, what a journey this knight has been on all the way to c3. And there's really nothing white can do about it. We're now threatening to capture the bishop on e2. And if a move like bishop d3 is played, we can continue with bishop a6, activating this bishop. Both of our bishops are extremely active in this position, and the knight on c3 speaks for itself. This pawn on d5 may seem like a very active and strong pawn for white. However, the truth is that this pawn is extremely weak in this position. I mean, following a move like rook fc1, which seems like a very logical option, simply trying to gang up on that knight on c3, we're not going to play a quiet move and play rook ac8 and allow white to take our knight, getting two minor pieces for only one rook. Instead, we're going to take on d5, and the very next move, capture back with our knight. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait a second, we are ahead a pawn. We just took both of white's quote-unquote strong pawns right in the center of the board. And in this position, white can't take the knight because we simply capture that bishop on d3. This bishop attacks the rook and defends the c4 square, and this bishop on g7 slices down on c3 and b2. So here in this position, guys, I mean, white has to play a move like rook a2. We're simply going to take that pawn on d5. We are ahead two pawns in this position. This rook can't even move, and here black has a simply won game. If you'd like to learn more on the theory behind each of these openings specifically, click the playlist to the left. If you'd like to learn more about the Petrov defense against e4 and play it just like Fabiano Caruana, click the video to the right. Leave a comment to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.